Gary, how's it going?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Fantastic. I'm going to continue the conversation, actually. So glad you're here that Bump and I were just having. We listened to some sound from Julio Rodriguez talking about what he feels like is a really stellar group in the outfield. And I do think that it's a better group. I know that everyone's really, frustrated with a lack of moves for this team. But I do think the outfield heading into this season is better than the one that broke spring training last year. Mitch and Dom Canzone in the corners there. This time you've got Robles and Rosarena. I'm eager to see this group. How do you feel about them?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think if the Mariners are going to go where they want to go, a lot of it's going to be on the outfield and the outfield being productive. You know, we talk a lot about what happened in September of last year and what was the key to September. And a lot of the conversation about kind of change in approach and Edgar and those things were certainly factors. But the lineup was better, too. The players they rolled out were better in that stretch. You look at Rosarena was part of that team. He wasn't there all season. He came over at the deadline. Robles was a top 5 outfielder in September. I don't think we can ask for that again because he was playing an elite level, but can he be a productive guy through the course of the season? And there's a lot about him that says you think he can. Julio was at his best towards the end of the season, so there's a lot of things to be hopeful for from the outfield, and a few of those things you need to carry over. Like you need a Randy Rosarena to be Randy Rosarena. You need Julio to even things out. And, when I think about the Mariners this season, and when I think about Julio, one of the things that we've seen so often the last couple of years, the last few years really, is they would have parts of the season, just huge peaks and valleys, right? There'd be times where they look like the absolute best team in baseball for a while, and there'd be times where it looks like you wonder if they're going to win a game. I mean, it would be that kind of peaks and valleys. Can they even those out a little bit more? And Julio's been kind of like that as well. If he can just even things out, I think he's going to have a monster season. I think he's poised to have a monster season. We'll see what happens. But if he can even out those valleys, and if the Mariners can even out those valleys, it would go a long ways.
Gary, go Cougs.
Go Cougs.
Yeah, those valleys, man. I was just looking at the splits of Robles and Rosarena and then Julio, and it's kind of like they're just passing each other with these valleys. It's like, all right, it's my turn to dip. Okay, you play well. My turn to dip. When you look at this roster and this lineup, what part concerns you the most? I think I know where you can go or where you're going to go with this, but what concerns you the most?
Well, injuries is always at the top, but I think you can say that for every single team. Like if you say, if you lose Julio, you lose Cal for a length of time, that would be bad. But I think you could say that with every team. You lose your top 1 or 2 guys, and it's not great. But I think production on the infield, as optimistic as I am about production on the outfield and catcher certainly, there are question marks about production on the infield. I feel great about Luke Raleigh, who we may still see some in the outfield as well, but I feel great about what he brings to first base. It's funny when you look at his numbers last year, and he didn't play a ton of first base, but if you compare his numbers to first baseman, WRC plus, he was in the top 5 in baseball last year, and the ones ahead of him are the ones you would expect to be ahead of him. The best, Vlad Guerrero, that kind of group, Freddie Freeman. Slugging percentage, he's just outside of the top 5 compared to first baseman. So I think you feel good about his production at first, but you look around the rest of the infield and you're hoping for a bounce back from Polanco. You're hoping for a bounce back from JP, and those things are certainly possible, more than possible. But that's what you're hoping for. And then you're hoping for somebody breaks through at second base. Moore, Bliss, Cole Young, go down the list. That's what you're hoping for. So when I kind of look at the Mariners and thinking about their production offensively, outfield I feel great about, and there's going to be some questions on the infield that they have to figure out during the course of the season. There's no question.
I'm going to keep focusing on JP for this one, Gary. If he were coming off his 2023 season, I think we'd be talking about the infield as, yeah, we have some questions, but look at this bright spot with JP, and oh my God, what can he do here? Obviously, he wasn't as successful in 2024, so a bit of a two-pronged approach. What do you think happened for JP last season that led to what looked like a regression, and what do you think he needs to do to get right if he can?
Yeah, I don't think he was fully healthy through most of the season. I think that played a factor. I don't think, realistically going into the season, at least how I looked at it, I don't think it was realistic to ask him to repeat what he did the year before. That may have been his career year, what we saw 2 years ago. I was hoping he would get somewhere near, which he did not. But that's what I'm hoping for again this year. I'm hoping that we get something in between 2 years ago and last year. And I think that's a reasonable ask because he's a very skilled player. He's a good hitter. Like, I think there is a bounce back there. It's just a question of how far, how much is going to bounce back. And honestly, I have the same feeling about Polanco. Like, I think there is a bounce back there. He has been a quality hitter in baseball for a long time. How much of a bounce back? And of course, with Polanco, he's changing positions as well. So there's another wild card in that mix. But that's how I kind of see that side of the infield. I'm looking for 2 bounce backs. It's a question of how much are we bouncing back?
Hey, Gary, I've never been to a spring training, but I would assume that it's there's a lot of things that are just standard across the country when it comes to spring training. But I also would assume that a guy like Dan Wilson might want to do things a bit differently, right, to make it his own a little bit or maybe switch things up. What are some things that you think he can do or will do during spring training?
You know, I'm actually interested to see how that plays out. This is my first day down here, so I'm curious to watch how things evolve and change and how he does things differently. I'm assuming there will be some things that he does differently during the course of the spring. It's funny, I just talked to him a second ago. I was actually, before I came over here, it was super exciting. I was watching Matt Brash throw, which was incredible. He looked great, by the way, which I think is going to be a big key to the Mariners season. And I was just talking to Dan and Pete Woodworth, the pitching coach, about a few different things. And, you know, I'm anxious to see what it looks like under Dan Wilson. And, you know, one of the things I think he's so good at, and it became very apparent when he took over last year, is just how much respect he has in the organization and how much the staff loves him. And you think it's not a mystery. I mean, he's a great guy, but he's someone that's been in the org for a long time, and he is someone that spent a lot of times in the minor leagues at, you know, a week at a time at Arkansas or Everett and go down the list. So he has built a relationship with a lot of the coaches that have come up. Like Pete Woodworth, for example, was a coach in the system that made his way to the major leagues. And during that time, Dan Wilson was there, and they formed a relationship. So I'm excited to see what it looks like, and I'm excited to see kind of how he integrates the staff into the conversations and what they're doing.
I think the Mariners, and this isn't a unique opinion here in Seattle, have the best 1 through 5 in terms of their starting rotation in baseball. We spend a lot of time talking about 1 through 3, though. A lot of time talking about 1 through 3, whether or not Kirby could end up being, you know, a Cy Young winner, best pitcher in baseball. You know, what can we see from Logan? And I feel like I don't want to say overlook, but can spend a little less time on Wu and Miller. And so I wanted to spend more time on those 2 with you. And I'll start for the purposes of just this question with one, and that being Miller. Where do you see as an area where he can take kind of a step forward this year? What are you looking at for his game? And have you changed your opinion on what his ceiling could be?
I have. He proved it last year. He took a massive jump last year. And he was a different pitcher is why. He changed his arsenal. He changed what he was doing. You know, the year before, there was a glaring weakness on what he needed to do. He was getting hit by lefties, and he was getting hit hard by lefties. So the question was going into last season, this time last year, is, okay, what is Miller going to do against lefties? And he answered that question in a big way. He changed a lot of the things he was doing, and he had a huge year. And part of me feels like he gets overshadowed, to your point. He gets overshadowed a little bit by, you know, Logan Gilbert had such a great year, and Castillo and Kirby as well, obviously. So I feel like if he was on a different staff, maybe it would have stood out even more what he did last year. But he had an incredible season. And so I have now been thinking about, okay, where is this going to go? What can he be? And right now, to me, I don't know where that ceiling is. I really don't. Because there were times last year where it looked like, okay, he can be an ace of a staff. Will he be an ace of a staff? I don't know, but there were times he looked like it last year. So I'm super excited to see about his follow-up and what that's going to look like this year.
You know, there's I guess some athletes reach a point in their career where you just accept who they are. Like, all right, this is who they are, and these are the things we're going to have to deal with. But there's so much young talent on this team. I look at a guy like Cal. He's a guy who's going to strike out a lot. He's going to drive in a lot of runs. He'll be great behind the plate. Is there something else you're looking to see Cal do, or are we at the point with Cal where we just accept who he is as a player?
Well, if he rolled out the same exact season this year as last year, that would be wonderful, because the season that he had last year puts him in the conversation as one of the best catchers in baseball. Like, he is in – I'm not saying he is the best catcher in baseball. He is in that conversation. If we're talking about, is it Rutschman, is it Cal, he is in that mix already. So that's the kind of a couple seasons in a row he's put together between what he does defensively, what he does with the pitching staff. And, you know, offensively, I still think there is some room to move there offensively. I would not expect like a huge jump in batting average, for example. I could see him picking up some points, though, on base percentage, and the power is just so legit. Like, he is a 30, pushing on 40 home run guy. And given all the games he plays at that position, his durability, that is just a rare package to get at that position. Because in context, it's a position right now where the offensive numbers are not great. I was looking at taking kind of all catchers and putting their slash line together, and it's not a pretty picture when you put the whole group together. So especially in the context of the position, what Cal is doing is pretty special.
One thing that, and Gary, I know you heard this a ton too, I'm sure. One thing I kept hearing last year, particularly when Julio was struggling, was, oh, God, if only you could take Cal's clutchness and put it into Julio, you'd have this superstar. Because we can always imagine and remember moments when, you know, Julio comes to the plate and you're just thinking, oh, all the talent in the world is there, just knock in this one run, and it wouldn't happen. And I'm sure he got in his own head, and who wouldn't? Julio's also very young. I know he's a couple years in, but he's still so young. Gary, do you think you can develop clutchness later, or do you think you just have it or you don't? Or do you think it's not real? I don't know. What's your theory on this kind of conversation?
Yeah, so I go back and forth on this. I think there's a part of it that's not real, because you're talking about such a small sample size.
Yeah.
Because clutchness, like, how many at-bats are we talking about through the course of the season? So part of that is just a numbers game where it's not real. I do think there is a psychology to it where you learn over time to kind of quiet the moment. And when I watch Julio in particular, and I felt this especially the first few months of the season last year, is he is someone that wants to be great, which is great. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we love him, right? Like, he really cares. He wants to be great. He wants the team to win. And I think when the team struggled last year through the first few months of the season, I think he put a lot of that weight on his shoulders. And baseball is a game that we know the harder you try sometimes, especially in those situations, the worse it can be. Like, the harder you swing is not necessarily the best in a scenario. So I felt like in those situations, when a team is struggling, and this can go beyond Julio, this can be anybody. When a team is struggling and you come up in a big situation and you have the feeling of, I have got to come through here, that's a lot of pressure. When you look at the last month, like September, for example, I think there was a reason why, if you go to home plate and the team is rolling, you go up to home plate and you're not thinking, man, if I don't get a hit here, we're not going to win. Because they weren't having that. With the way they were rolling, they weren't having that feeling. So I'm hoping that the Mariners can get off to a better start, certainly, especially offensively. And I'm hoping that Julio can play a relaxed game, because a Julio relaxed at the plate is a difference maker. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about Julio and clutch and everything. Yeah. I think, and to your point, he is young. It is something I think you learn over time.
Speaking of clutch, Demo has some clutch moments and throughout his career, and then we're going to see a bit more of him. Is he a guy that feels no pressure at all? Because I don't think anyone is really expecting too much out of him. Or what do you think his approach is to his opportunity he's going to have this year?
It's funny. I just asked him about that. I was talking about his defense in particular, because one of the big strengths that should not be overlooked, there's a reason why he won the Gold Glove last year at the utility, is like he is an actual plus defender at all these different positions. It's one thing, like, you can tell me to go stand in left field, and sure, I can do it. I can't do it well, but Demo actually does all of this really well. And so I asked him, because as rosters kind of evolve and change, and on paper things look different going into a season. So I asked him, like, how do you get ready for a season? You get ready like thinking, hey, I'm going to play. Like, you look on paper this year and it looks like he's going to play a lot more second base, right? That's how we see it. And so, I asked, like, how do you get ready to play everything? Or this year, do you get ready to play second base more? And he said he goes to the manager early in spring and he'll ask, like, what do you see my role? What do you see happen? And usually the manager will tell him the situation, and usually that's not how it works out at all, because that's the way baseball goes. And he's so versatile, like he's the first one that gets moved around if there's a problem. So today it looks like he's going to play a lot of second base. But as we move through the season, who knows what's going to end up happening? And he's just the kind of player that's going to have to move around. But he's going to have an opportunity. I think that's for sure. And I think especially against lefties during the course of the season, no matter what happens. Like Cole Young could be great at second base at some point during the course of the season. Dylan Moore is still going to find playing time. And he's just super valuable because of everything he does defensively.
A tough question, Gary, but Jerry DiPoto, I think, was leaning pretty heavily into the offensive success at the late stage of the season, pointing to that and hoping that there would be some optimism to draw from that. And I don't blame him for that at all. But it's hard for me to look at it and not think, well, that's a relatively small sample size, and you were kind of healthy, and what can I take from that? So instead, I'm going to ask you, as a much smarter baseball mind, what do you take, if anything, from those last 40 days? Is there anything in your conversations with players, with coaches at all, that you think, oh, okay, that's interesting that they change this or that?
I wouldn't say smart and me in the same sentence, but beyond that.
I would, Gary.
Moving beyond that, so I think there are some things to take away. And I think the most important thing to take away is their lineup was better. Like, the players were better in the last month. Like, that I think matters coming into this season. Like, having a Rosarena for a whole season, as we talked about, having Robles for a whole season, we talked about. I think that really matters. I do find the conversations about hitting to be really interesting this offseason. And, they've been using a word, making it more simple a lot, whether you're talking to Kevin Seitzer or Bobby Magianis, who's his assistant hitting coach now, or Dan Wilson or Edgar. You kind of go down the list. And the conversation about hitting is really different this year. And it kind of changed in September last year, which I think was good because, as we all saw, what was happening wasn't working, obviously. So I think a change was needed. And they're talking about hitting in a different way. And how that's going to translate to a full season this year, I don't know. I'm anxious to see it. It's funny. I've been talking to hitters, Dylan Moore, too. I just asked him about this because it sounds easy when you say, hey, just make it simple. Just see the ball, hit the ball, that sort of thing. Why can't you do that? And, because it's such a simple concept. Just go do it. And Dylan had a great answer, I thought, because he talked about, a failure makes it the problem. Failure is the problem because when you are failing, you try and figure out, okay, what am I doing wrong? What does my swing look like? Where are my attack? So you dive into the data. I mean, it just kind of can snowball onto itself. So I'm curious to see more than mechanics, more than anything else, just kind of a mental approach that a really veteran kind of hitting group will impact this team. It's like, I don't have the answer to what. It's a really good question that you ask. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm curious to see kind of how it plays out.
Gary, there are some things that I love about the start of spring training. Obviously, we get some short days here on the radio. That's always good.
That's number one. Yes, I understand.
Get some short days. But
most people care about that.
It's the season is upon us, right? But the worst thing I hate about spring training is that if a guy is balling, people say, doesn't matter, spring training. If a guy is struggling, doesn't matter, it's spring training. I'm like, then why the hell are we playing these games then? Like, all right, so how should the average fan be digesting what is happening during spring training?
Yeah, you just asked the wrong guy that question. Okay, I have a very, I think, realistic approach to spring training is wins and losses don't matter. Like, if the Mariners win 5 games in spring, if they win 15 games in spring, whatever, it does not translate to the regular season. Stats don't matter because once you watch spring training consistently, you realize there are so many wild cards from game to game. Whether, hey, you could be a random guy facing a double A pitchers for like 3 games in a row, or the wind could be blowing out 3 days in a row. It's just there's so much randomness down here. It's hard to draw conclusions from stats. Now, there are interesting things that happen during games. And it's kind of a more old school feel to spring, I think, because, as opposed to during the regular season when you dive into the analytics and look at the numbers, spring is more like, hey, how did he look? When a guy's maybe he's throwing his fastball 3 miles per hour harder. Well, that matters going into the regular season. It doesn't matter what his ERA is, but if his fastball is 3 miles per hour harder or 3 miles per hour less going into the regular season, like that really matters. And for me, I think the thing I enjoy the most about spring is watching guys that we don't get a chance to see. Like we hear about Cole Young, we hear about Cole Emerson, Montes, go down the list of all these young players that we just hear about. And this is our chance to kind of see them in person and see what they look like. And that's becoming more relevant because they're getting closer to knocking on the door of the major leagues. Like Cole Young is a guy that we could see this year. So I'm really anxious to just see what it looks like with him on the field. And he's going to get a lot of at-bats this spring. So there are a lot of interesting things that happen during the games. Just peel back the layers.
Gary, did you hear about the comet that could potentially hit Earth in like 2032 or whatever? Or an asteroid? Curtis, what is it? A comet, an asteroid?
It's an asteroid.
Different? An asteroid.
Oh, it's an asteroid.
Okay, it's an asteroid that could hit Earth, and it's got like a 3.6% chance to hit Earth. It's like the size of like a large van. Like, I don't know that it'll be devastating, but it has like a 3.2 chance percent to hit Earth in 2032. The Mariners have a lower percentage chance to win the World Series this year, and I didn't like that feeling. However, the same column that I read from ESPN, it did win totals, and it gave them 84.5. And weirdly, I felt like I would take the over. Like I felt like I could see a season where they got more. When it comes to, I'm not asking for a win total per se, but do you feel like this is a team where it's like, yeah, they're an 85-win team with a reasonable belief that they can do more? Is that kind of how you see them, or do you see them as even better than that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, because I do think there's upside. There's room to move up. And when I was thinking about the Mariners coming into this season, there are 2 areas where I think they have to get better and find answers. And we talked about one of them with production on the infield. And that's a spot they're going to have to find a way to get production on the infield. The other spot that they're going to have to be better, and I feel like is an overlooked issue last year because we spent so much time talking about the infield, but I think the back of the bullpen, they had issues last year, and it cost them some games last year. And there's a reason why, because Santos hardly pitched and we didn't see Brash at all. And so I think they need to find some answers in the back of the bullpen, because, you're not going to, when you hand your bullpen a 1-run lead or 2-run lead, you're not going to win all those games. But the way the Mariners are built, they've got to win the majority of those games, because that's the deal. They're not going to outslug teams most of the time. When they have leads late, they got to finish those games out. So a healthy Brash, I think, is enormous. Like, I think they make the playoffs last year if Brash is healthy. He's a very unique and special weapon in baseball with his strikeout percentage and how they use him. So him back healthy is enormous. And they could use like a Spire bounce back, Taylor for a full season, being what he was last year. There are some pieces back there, and Santos being healthy, to make it better, but they're going to have to find solutions to make it better. But yeah, a long way of answering that. I think there's some room to move on that.
He is Mariners broadcaster Gary Hill, kind enough to join us on the Emerald Queen Casino Sportsbook Hotline. Thanks for your time, Gary. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary.
Anytime.
See ya.
Talk to you soon.